and welcome to the 522nd of our series of Distinguished Speakers programs. I'm Cindy O'Connell, and I have the privilege of serving as your club president.
Now, I would like Ms. Turnbull to introduce our distinguished guests.
Thank you so much. We have the privilege and opportunity today to hear from an honest-to-goodness economist. Dr. Harry Holzer is the John Lafarge Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University and an Institute Fellow at the American Institute for Research in Washington, D.C. He received both his BA and PhD from Harvard University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings and a research affiliate at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an affiliated scholar with the Urban Institute, and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. Dr. Holzer is an expert on the low-wage labor market and has particularly studied the problems of minority workers in urban areas. He has authored or focused on disadvantaged American workers and their employers, as well as on education and workforce issues and labor market policy. His work has contributed to both state and federal economic policy. He served as chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor under the Clinton administration and advised the Obama administration on the inclusion of employment and training initiatives in the American Recovery and Reconstruction Act of 2009. His research on the difficulties faced by ex-offenders in the job market contributed to policies which ultimately resulted in the First Step Act of 2018. And his research on minority employment difficulties and affirmative action has been cited in Supreme Court decisions. But lest you are overwhelmed by this amazing list of accomplishments and contributions, Dr. Holzer is one of us. He grew up on a farm in New Jersey, and since my father was also an economist that grew up on a farm, I asked him if there was something in the soil that bred economists. And I'm going to let him tell you the answer to that question. Dr. Holzer's wife, Deborah, is a clinical social worker and therapist, and they have 3 daughters, two of them, right, twins. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Harry Holzer to the podium.
Thank you very much, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's getting to that time of year when people do like to fly south and enjoy your nice weather. There's actually better reasons for me to be here. I'm actually very anxious to hear your points of view excuse me, on immigration and other issues. Folks like me can sometimes spend a little too much time in the academy, in the ivory tower, and I always learn a lot when I step out in what we often call the real world, the real people. Perspectives from the business community, from higher ed, et cetera. So I'm very much anxious to hear your points of view on that. Cindy warned me to never, ever, ever confuse the Gators and the Seminoles, so I won't do that in any part of my talk. I actually started my career teaching at Michigan State University for about 15 years, where I was often considered to be insufficiently partisan in support of the Spartans as opposed to the Wolverines. So that was a complicated issue on that campus, so I won't make that mistake. One other thing, so Marjorie did mention that I grew up on a farm, a chicken farm in New Jersey. I don't know if we have any current or former chicken farmers in the room, but this was the days when there was like a long chicken coop in the backyard. I actually grew up thinking everybody's backyard smelled like that. Turned out not to be the case. My parents were also immigrants. My parents were Holocaust survivors from Poland. They came to the country separately and then met and married in the early 1950s. And I do have to say that has a lot of impact on your worldview in a lot of ways. I think it has molded my interest my entry into labor economics was because of my interest in people not doing so well. There's a lot of people in the world not doing so well for a lot of different reasons. I'd like to talk about immigration and the U.S. labor market today from my vantage point as an economist, a labor economist. I'm going to focus on the overall U.S. labor market. I know that you have some particular issues here in Florida. I think a lot of what I'm going to say has relevance to Florida. I know you have heavy tourist industry, heavy agriculture, also some biomedical and advanced manufacturing. I will try to address issues relevant to that, but I'm happy to engage on questions more specific to the Florida economy during the Q&A. So I look forward to that. And this is just a list of what I'd like to cover in the 20 minutes or so that I have to speak. I think it makes sense to start with a few words about the state of the U.S. labor market, where it is currently, but also what some of the long-term trends look like. A few basic facts about immigration at the aggregate level, at the national level. And then I start to get into the real issues about how does immigration affect the U.S. economy broadly, but then the very important issue of does immigration hurt native-born workers? Does it reduce their employment rates, their earnings, et cetera? A few additional factors very relevant to this debate, I think, like what to do about the undocumented population. And then I'll talk about policy, I think both for immigration and immigration reform, but maybe more broadly for workers as well. So I'll see if I can make it through all that in 20 minutes. I try not to languish anywhere. So just a few words about the U.S. labor market. Very simply, the current labor market is quite strong, with national unemployment in the vicinity of 3.5 to 3.7. I think it's actually even a little lower in Florida. I think it's been closer to 3 in Florida. Rising labor force activity. A lot of people who had dropped out of the labor market during the Great Recession, maybe before, are actually trickling back in. And that has been what has enabled this recovery to go on for so long. The fact that we keep having job growth every month at the national level, about 160, 170,000 per month, that would not be possible unless you were drawing people in who had left the labor force. So that has continued to happen. And wages are rising somewhat faster than inflation. Last year they've averaged about 3% wage growth. Inflation is somewhere between 1.5%, 1.75%. So there's at least a little bit of wage growth going on ahead of inflation to help workers. So almost everything now looks relatively positive, but the long-term trends have not been so positive on any of those fronts. Wages in America for several decades now have been quite stagnant when you adjust for inflation. And economists argue with each other a lot about how even to measure wages. For instance, exactly which index do you use to control for inflation? It turns out that has a big effect, wage growth we've had. How do you think about health benefits? Should they count as your measure or not? So in the way that I measure wages, and I'm talking about cash wages, not benefits, median wages have risen by about 15% after inflation in the last 40 years. 15% over 40 years is not a huge amount of wage growth. So I think it's fair to say that wages have been fairly stagnant. But of course, some groups have done much better than others. On average, women have done considerably better than men in terms of the increases. Of course, the college-educated have done much better than those without any kind of college degree. So different groups have had different experiences. But inequality has grown enormously in our labor market. In fact, the biggest gaps, and I leave out the top 1% when I look at these numbers, because the top 1% is, people often say is hard to think about. In the bottom 99%, that's mostly a story about higher education and the growing gaps between people who have higher education degrees and those who don't. And that gap roughly doubled between around 1980 and 2000, and it has stayed at that level ever since. So inequality has become a big issue. And when you have high inequality with stagnant wages, that means a lot of folks are not doing well and not progressing at all in the market. And because of that, labor force participation has been weakening, especially among less educated men. That's the group who has seen the worst wage outcomes as good paying jobs for blue-collar workers have disappeared for those without any post-secondary skills. Now, if you have the right skill, of course, the right credential, some technical knowledge, those folks can still do very well in the labor market. Many lack that. So those are some of the challenges. And of course, going forward, we know We're going to have major change in the country's demographics on what we call the supply side of the labor market, the worker side. A lot of automation on the demand side, the employer side. How do all of those change the conversation? So that's the sort of labor market context that I think we ought to think about as we discuss immigration. So just some basic facts about immigration at the national level. There are about 47 million immigrants in the United States today. It's about 14% of the U.S. population. That is a relatively high level by historical standards. About a quarter of them are undocumented, close to 11 million. Undocumented, that number used to be a little higher. It used to be over 12, but about a quarter are undocumented. About 7 million of those folks are working in the labor market as undocumented workers. We have very high variation in the skills and education levels of that immigrant population. And for a long time, it was very simple to describe immigrants as being bimodal in terms of education, meaning a lot of people at the high end and even more people at the low end, not as much in between. So you had college graduates, people with technical degrees, engineers, often from Asia and parts of Europe. A lot of workers at the low end, often less than a high school diploma, many coming from Latin America. You're starting to have a growth of more of a middle. Think of nurses from the Philippines or from other places. That middle area is growing. Historically, we've had a lot more immigration at the low end than the high end. At the national level, that has started to change. In the last decade, low end and high end, low skill and high skill immigration have been more in balance. On the other hand, the immigration numbers overall have been dropping for about a decade, and certainly in the last few years, given the political environment, they're dropping even more. And we should think about whether that's a good thing for our economy or not. And then lastly, when immigrants come, on average, it takes them about 2 to 3 generations for their kids to catch up with everybody else. Now, obviously, some groups get there faster than others. Your Cuban population here in Florida got there a lot more quickly. Of course, many came with higher skills and more education. So there's a lot of variation across different country origins of these folks in terms of how long it takes to get there. My ethnic group, the East European Jews, got there relatively quickly, and often within a generation catch up, or even do slightly better, but that varies a lot according to the population. So this is just some facts about immigration to keep in the background. Now, how does immigration affect the U.S. economy? A lot of the effects are quite positive. And I've listed what I think are the 3 most important positive effects. First of all, very simply, immigrants lower the prices and raise the quantity of goods and services produced in many industries. They make it easier to produce our goods and services, and often at lower costs. I've listed some of the sectors there, where at least nationally, where you see a lot of immigrants, and especially in health and elder care. As my generation starts to retire, I'm not there yet, hope not to be for a while, but the demands on the healthcare and elder care system become very important, and that's a very important industry, I think, to which immigrants are contributing among many others. So that overall impact is positive on the level of output in the economy. But the second thing, they are raising our labor force participation rates, the growth in our labor force, and contributing to economic growth. Economic growth in the U.S. has not been very impressive. There was a small bump up last year, that's mostly gone. We've been in and around the range of 2% for many years. Now, economic growth comes down to 2 things. Number 1, is your labor force growing? And number 2, how productive is that labor force in producing goods and services? And the numbers haven't been great on either side of that. But as the baby boomers retire and as the labor force shrinks, the native-born labor force, it's quite important to have those immigrants to bump up labor force growth and to still creating a growing economy. Because economies that are shrinking tend to stagnate. There's not a lot of investment opportunities, and so the immigrant participation helps us there. And thirdly, as we all know, we have a real federal fiscal crisis. Again, as the baby boomers age and start drawing on their retirement programs, and of course, as our federal government shows absolutely no fiscal discipline whatsoever on either side of the aisle. And immigrants help there as well. very simply because they're more likely to be taxpayers rather than retirees drawing on the system. Now, some immigrant groups contribute more fiscally than others. Those with higher skills and higher incomes in general contribute more. But even the less skilled immigrants, the low-wage immigrants, their children and their grandchildren will do a lot better, will contribute to the economy in a fiscal sense. So those are what I think are the three of the most important benefits that come from immigration. But as everything in economics, we have both benefits and costs. And that's true everywhere. And what a lot of people worry about is, do immigrants take jobs from native-born workers, or do they at least compete with those workers? Do they drive down their wages? What does that story look like? And it's sort of two sides of the same point, because the way in which immigrants reduce the costs of production in a lot of industries are in fact by demanding somewhat lower wages than native-born workers would demand. So that's a two-sided coin, where one side is quite positive for the American economy, but the other side might not be as positive for U.S. workers. And there's a couple of simplistic stories you hear, one from the pro-immigration camp and one from the anti-immigration camp. And you hear a lot of those voices on both sides in Washington, D.C. So the pro-immigration stance will be, well, immigrants only take jobs that native-born workers will not take. I think that's an oversimplification. Now, in a few industries like agriculture, that's probably true. I know very few native-born Americans, especially of my kids' generation, that have any interest in going to agricultural work, or even some of these other industries. And so might not even try there. Now, what a lot of economists would say is, in other industries, native-born folks would be more willing to go into those industries if the wages were higher. And if the immigrants weren't here, employers would be forced to pay higher wages, and that would draw folks in. Well, maybe yes and maybe no. And the shapes of those supply and demand curves. By how much would wages have to rise? By how much would your business costs have to rise to draw those native-born workers in? And of course, pretty quickly, it might make a lot more sense to automate those jobs rather than to try to get workers. But I think that's a simplification. And in lots of industries, residential construction, certain parts of manufacturing, those were industries that native-born folks, whites, African Americans, for a long time had a lot of interest in and did relatively well in, and their presence in those industries. I said to somebody this morning, I've never seen a non-Latino residential construction worker where I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Not once. Not one at any level below skilled electrician or plumber or something like that. The inroads, the extent to which Latino immigrants have come to dominate that industry is really striking. And I can tell you, I know that there's a lot of native-born folks that would have liked those jobs, especially at slightly higher wages. But then there's another argument from the anti-immigration folks that is just as simplistic. This notion that every job is a job and there's a fixed number, and every time an immigrant takes one, that's one less for the native-born folks. Well, that's absolutely not true, right? Because the labor market's dynamic. And the labor market has all kinds of ways of adjusting. And again, for those of you that once had econ, maybe in college, and I apologize if that's bringing up a bad memory for anybody, but the labor market has ways of adjusting. If there's a shift in the supply of workers, the labor market adjusts to absorb them. Now, wages will have to adjust, but new jobs get created to absorb that population with some wage adjustment going on. So it's simply not true that a job is fixed and there's one-for-one loss. There's labor market adjustments that go on in all these situations. I think that's the right way to think about it. Now, another thing that's really important is this issue of which workers are complements to American workers and others, which immigrant workers are complements to American workers, and which ones are substitutes, and for which groups of workers. So, for those of you that do remember some economics, complements, let's say in terms of goods or services, are two kinds of goods and services that move together. So in fact, if one of them becomes more available, demand might even rise for the other. Think of hot dogs and mustard, right? If all of a sudden there was some major innovation and we had a lot more hot dogs in our economy, the demand for mustard would rise, because those are demand for beer would probably rise a lot, even more importantly. But then you have products that might be substitutes that really are competing, hot dogs and hamburgers, right? So if there was a big increase in the supply of hamburgers in the economy, that would drive down demand for hot dogs. Same thing for workers. Some groups of workers complement each other, whereas some directly compete with each other. So think about it like this in the following sense. If you had a big increase in the immigrant population, low-skilled immigrant population, and some firms were able to turn to those immigrants for their janitorial services, maybe their clerical services, and they brought down the costs, that would reduce the prices that the firm has to charge, and that would actually raise, if let's say it's an engineering firm, that would raise the demand for the engineers, right? So you can think of janitorial folks being complements to the higher education folks and maybe raising the demand for them, while at the same time they reduce demand for people who otherwise would have been in those jobs. So that becomes the key question. You know, which groups of immigrants and which groups of American workers are complementary to each other versus which are substitutes, and that ends up being a statistical issue. And statistical analysis ends up answering those questions. I know you don't want me to drone on and on about the statistics. Let me give you how I read that literature. I think highly skilled immigrant workers with college degrees or higher mostly complement workers in our economy, and overall very good for the economy. And especially if you're talking about engineers or people with biomedical training and things like that. First of all, those labor markets are almost always tight, even when the rest of the economy is sinking into recession. So those workers can be pretty easily absorbed without displacing necessarily someone else. And the data show highly skilled immigrants create a lot of business startups. That creates demand for almost everybody. They generate a high number of patents relative to their numbers in the population. That creates opportunities for everybody. So overall, they're complementary with most groups of workers in the economy, with a few exceptions. The exceptions are, of course, the engineers who may need to compete with engineers coming from parts of Asia or Europe. In my field, native-born graduate students have faced a lot more competition because many, many more people getting economics PhDs are international students now, and so that makes them all a little less happy about the competition from immigrants. But overall, highly skilled immigrants are on net very positive for the U.S. economy. With less skilled workers, less educated workers, I think there's more question, maybe more of a trade-off there. Do they substitute for less educated native-born workers? And again, certainly not in agriculture, possibly a lot more in construction and some of those industries. There's been a big debate among economists, and we call it the Borjas-Card debate. Two very, very good economists, George Borjas at Harvard, who by the way, was a Cuban immigrant around 1960 and grew up here in Florida, as well as David Card, who used to be at Princeton, now he's at UCal Berkeley. Card, and I'll just take a minute to describe, as you often know, there's this old joke about if you get a couple of economists who hear, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, and Harry Truman once said, I want to see a one-handed economist. I don't want to hear it. But the truth is if you're analyzing the data, you can cut the data in a lot of different ways, and people argue about what's more appropriate and what's less appropriate. The David Card kind of research historically, and this is what most labor economists did, they compared across geographic areas, across states or across metro areas. And those areas with high immigrant populations, Miami, San Francisco, New York, were wages or employment depressed for the native-born workers that had absorbed a lot of immigrants? The answer was always no. You didn't see any negative effect on the wages or employment levels of native-born workers, and that was sort of the traditional view among economists. It doesn't hurt anybody. George Borjas started to think about this a little differently. He said that's kind of a phony test, because number one, immigrants tend to target thriving labor markets where employment rates are already high. And number two, they often drive native-born workers out of the area. When you have really high levels of immigration, and I'm sure you've seen this in Miami and some of the other cities here, at some point, native-born workers start to move out, to relocate. And it might be in those new destinations that the competition, that the displacement really occurs. So the immigrants are coming to Miami, but that's not the place where the substitution and the competition occurs. That might occur in Charlotte, North Carolina, or Richmond, Virginia, wherever these folks are migrating to. And so Borjas did a kind of a more aggregate type analysis, and he found more negative effects of immigration on and especially less educated immigrants on the native-born workers. Now, my view is that as often I come out somewhere in between those two guys. On the one hand, I think Card is understating the competition between native-born and immigrants for some of the reasons that Borjas mentioned. I think Borjas overstates it. Because my guess is some of the negative things he attributes to immigration are really the forces of technology and trade and these other factors that are correlated with immigration, but are really hurting these less educated men. So my view is, does less skilled immigration have a negative effect on native-born workers' wages? I'd say yes, but it's a relatively small effect. And by the way, we can talk about this afterwards. I still think that less educated workers also bring a lot of benefits to the economy. And especially in some of those industries like healthcare and elder care and childcare and agriculture, they make really important contributions. I'm just saying I think it's a little more of a trade-off for less educated workers, given the competition they provide to some of our native-born folks. And I see a lot less of that trade-off with higher skilled workers. I think for them, the benefits are overwhelmingly positive. That leads me to an important question. I stated at the outset, our less educated workers in America, especially our less educated men, have not done well in the last 30, 40 years. Their wages have stagnated or even declined. What else is going on if it's not immigration? Now, a lot of voters in America tend to blame trade and immigration for workers' woes. And I think there's at least a little bit of truth to that, but I think the list of challenges that our non-college educated workers have faced is much longer. And reading the literature and the statistical evidence, I list these 6 other factors. I tried to list them more or less in order of the magnitude of the negative effect on workers, starting with automation. The digital economy, and we call it SBTC, skill-biased technical change. Very simply, automation. You can ask the same question. Automation is a complement for some kinds of workers, but a substitute for others. The people who have really been displaced in large numbers are production workers and clerical workers in lots of jobs that used to pay really well for someone with only a high school degree or even without a high school degree. That same automation has raised the demand for college-educated workers, especially engineers and technicians, and many other people who've actually become more productive in their jobs because of automation. So again, it helps some and it hurts others. Imports. Historically, economists have not believed a similar thing. Economists have not believed that imports have really hurt American workers. That really changed in the first decade of this century after China entered the World Trade Organization, and there was a flood of imported manufacturing products from China that really decimated a lot of, especially those Midwestern states, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where a lot of workers got displaced, and a lot of those regions took a beating, even though I think imports do a lot of positive things as well. Declining unionism. I'm not making a good or bad argument for unionism, I'm just saying the fact that they have shrunk so dramatically, at least in the private sector, has been one more factor that has led to wage stagnation and a declining federal minimum wage relative to median wages in the economy. Historically, the federal minimum was always set at about 50% of median wages, and then it would trickle down with inflation. They'd bump it back up, it would trickle down. Right now, the federal minimum at 7.25% is about 1/3 of the median wage in the United States, is between 21 and 20. That's a very low level historically, and I think that contributes something to inequality. And by the way, because of that, a lot of states and cities are moving ahead on their own. I am not a big enthusiast for $15 minimum wages. I think in a lot of ways that's a mistake, but we can come back to that. Deregulation of some key sectors has hurt workers. As most of you know, until about the 1970s, we had several sectors of our economy, airlines, trucking, telecom, and several others that were very heavily regulated, and that eliminated competition. And that was good both for the firms, those industries, and the workers. The deregulation of the economy that started under Jimmy Carter, continued under Ronald Reagan and others, did hurt workers in those protected sectors. But what's happening now at the same time in some other sectors, industry is consolidating, the concentration of employers in some of these industries is growing, which means more profits for them, but often that gives them market power vis-a-vis their workers. When there's fewer firms demanding your services, there's less competition for your labor services. That has happened as well, and on top of that, a lot of employers demand their workers sign these non-compete agreements, these non-disclosure agreements, which does reduce competition in that labor market, and that's not very positive. So that's the list, and they say, well, where does immigration fall on this list? Immigration is sort of at the low end. Immigration, I think, has hurt less educated workers, probably less than most of those other factors, certainly less than the first 4. So if it's a concern, it's not the biggest thing we should worry about. So there's a few other considerations. I think I should probably wrap up fairly soon. Okay, that'll take my time in that case. So undocumented immigrants, that is still an issue separate from the legal documented population. I think the presence of 11 million people here and 7 million workers without documentation is a major problem for the country. I think in some sense they lead to even more wage stagnation because they can't compete as effectively, and since they get paid usually sub-market wages, they do more to undercut the native-born workers in those industries. I also think it's bad for the kids and the grandkids in those families, to grow up often with that level of stress and more poverty. I think there's a lot of evidence, and I've contributed to this, that all else equal, poverty makes the next generation, when children grow up and they've been in poverty, it makes them less productive. And they have more health problems and, of course, legal problems, incarceration, etc. I think the presence of this large undocumented population is a problem that we need to address. Another thing is less skilled immigrants also directly contribute to inequality in the economy. So I mostly talked about how less skilled immigrants compete with native-born workers. But directly, more bodies at the low end leads to more inequality and more poverty. If you do a simple calculation, the presence of immigrants raises the U.S. poverty rate, which now by the official measure is about 12%. It raises it by 1 or 2 percentage points. Not a huge effect, but it increases it. But it does contribute to inequality. And even when there are children in the labor force, it will raise inequality. And it'll probably raise racial and political strife in America. Because I think inequality is contributing to strife right now in a lot of ways. This will add. So I think it's just one more dimension to think about when we talk about policy. Of course, the demographics of the U.S. are changing, not just because of immigration, by the way, but also because my generation, the baby boomers, are retiring, and the native-born birth rate has really declined. It declined a lot during the Great Recession. Depressions and recessions are bad times for childbearing, but they haven't bounced back as the economy's recovered, which has puzzled a lot of people. Native-born folks are simply having fewer kids, so that already adds to the demographic change and creates, in some sense, even more of a need for immigrants to sort of fill some of those holes and grow our labor force. And then we have all this automation coming, and that could be a whole separate talk, which I don't want to do. I think the people who say all the jobs are going to disappear and robots and AI are going to do everything, I think those are silly arguments. Many, many, many jobs will remain. If some people do get their tasks displaced, others will open up. But it will lead to a fair amount of displacement and churning in the labor market. And a lot of those folks will get hurt. And I do fear that will continue to be skill biased, that our less educated workers will be not only easier to replace, but they'll have the hardest time adapting to the new automation in the economy. Because folks, we know how to adapt. We see some automation coming, and the automation might do these tasks that we do now and not these. We know how to retask, to retool and reboot, and learn the new skills that will make us more complementary with the machinery. A lot of less educated folks have much more harder time with that adjustment process. So there's some real challenges coming, but the silly notion that all the jobs are going to disappear and everyone needs a sort of a universal income support, I think that's silly. And not helpful to the conversation. So, what do I think has to change policy-wise? And these are my views, and others can read the evidence and see it differently. I would argue, first of all, that what we have called comprehensive immigration reform still makes sense. And the last time we had a comprehensive immigration reform bill was in 2013. It passed the Senate quite easily with the support of both the Florida senators, especially Senator Rubio. It did not pass the House. I'm not saying that the next bill should be exactly that bill. I'm sort of saying the broad pillars: increase the flow of legal immigrants, decrease the flow of illegal immigrants, and help the undocumented get some path to legality. I think those are still the right pillars, even though we might do each of them a little differently than in the past. But I would recommend 2 changes. I think, first of all, immigrants do enough good in our economy that we probably should have more of them, not less of them, especially as the demographics change and native-born workers get fewer and fewer in number. The importance of the immigrants to maintaining growth in our economy is growing. We need more immigrants, not less. But at the same time, I would shift the composition a little bit more towards the higher skilled end. Because as I argued before, the higher skilled immigrants, it's not that the less educated immigrants don't help the economy, they do, but their impacts are more mixed. Highly educated immigrants, I think, are more of a net benefit to the economy. So I would shift the composition. And as you may know, right now, about 2/3 of our immigrants, of our legal immigrants, come because of family reunification. About 1/3 are for all the other visa slots and H-1B and H-2A and H-2C and all those things. I would probably equalize those numbers a little more. I think I'd rather see more than 1/3 of the economy driven by our skill needs to make an investment in the economy. Although I certainly wouldn't shut off and close the door on the less educated either. And the last thing I would couple, given that our immigration has arguably hurt some of our native-born workers, especially less educated, I would couple any immigration reform with a package of policies to help less educated workers do better in our economy. And if you're asking what might those policies be, well, here's a short list of things that I would start with. I mean, I would start with workforce options and workforce programs at community colleges. Marjorie and I were talking about during lunch. I think we could do a lot better on the workforce side. I think we could help the community colleges fund more strong programs. We can talk about that. And more broadly, I would broaden spending on public higher ed in America. You know, in many, many states, I don't know if it's true here in Florida, public subsidies for higher education has been falling. It's been flat in real terms, falling as a percent of the budget because simply there have been competing demands from Medicaid and other sources. I think if we want a population that's going to be skilled and competitive and can adapt to automation, we can't continue to restrict funding for higher ed. So I would start there. But I would also strengthen the workforce system. You know, we have something like 3,000 one-stop shops run by the Department of Labor funding that they now call American Job Centers. They have a shoestring budget in most places. And that's the place where if people really want to know what's in high demand so they know what to train themselves in at a community college, that's where you can learn. It's ironic that we have 3,000 of those shops, yet the vast majority of people who go to community college or four-year college never set foot in a one-stop and never get any real career counseling and labor market counseling. That's really got to change. That's an enormous, you know, and one of the things you see in a lot of community colleges, they simply can't afford to beef up counseling, whether it's academic counseling or career counseling. And I think a lot of students at community colleges kind of wander aimlessly, having no idea what the economy really rewards for that factor. So I would improve that. I would have some moderate minimum wage increases, not 15 at the federal level. I'd probably be comfortable sort of gradually going to 10 at the federal level. And I think workers need some more voice in the workplace. Historically, unions have done that. Whatever you think of unions, they ain't coming back anytime soon in the private sector. There's other models of worker voice, like worker councils. And there's evidence that in many cases, worker voice in the workplace makes them more productive, gives them more of a stake in the output of the firm. I think there's ways to amend the national labor relations legislation to make worker councils more effective and more present in the workplace. I think that would be a good thing for many businesses as well as workers. And then finally, we have to start preparing for this automation that's coming with autonomous vehicles and so many other changes. And there's a range of things we could do to make our labor market more friendly to people that need to adjust their skills. Lifelong learning accounts, subsidizing employers who retrain rather than lay off their workers when they automate, etc. So that's my list. It may not be the right list, but those are some of the things I think about. I think this is an enormously important issue. As you know, it's so controversial in America today. I wish we could have a few calmer voices in that conversation to really look at the two sets of arguments and what's the right mix of different kinds of immigrants rather than the sort of huge emotion and often misleading comments on both sides, both extremes in that debate. It's not unusual to immigration. That's happening in so many issues in the country. But I'd like to stop here. Thank you for listening to me. And I'm very interested in hearing your own comments, your own reactions, and your experiences in this case. And if you think I got something wrong, happy to hear about it and we can talk about it. But thank you very much.